The snow hid the blood, but not the urgency. For 3 days she kept him alive in the warmth of the cabin, until she woke up surrounded by the entire tribe. What happened next changed everything. Subscribe to the channel and find out what happened. The rain was falling mercilessly over the Pantanal when Iracema heard the scream. It wasn't the sound of nocturnal birds, nor of alligators prowling the turbulent floodwaters. It was a human sound, desperate, almost childlike. The Pantanal during that flood season was treacherous even for the most experienced riverside dwellers. She hesitated for seconds, her hammock still swaying with her weight, her fingers clutching a cup of lemon balm tea. But the uneasiness in her chest was stronger. She grabbed the battery-powered flashlight, hastily put on her rubber boots and went out into the storm. The red mud stuck to her steps, making each movement a struggle against nature that seemed determined to keep her within the safety of her small, stilt house. The yellowish light of the flashlight cut through the darkness as she descended to the riverbank that now lapped at the pillars of her porch. The watercourse had risen almost 2 meters in the last 24 hours, swallowing low trees and shrubs. It was then that the beam of light found the small body. It was a boy. He couldn't have been more than 9 years old. He was clinging to a floating log, his small dark hands clenched on the wood like claws. There was blood mixed with the muddy water, a deep cut on his forehead. His face, partially submerged, revealed indigenous features. Black, straight hair stuck to his face, eyes half closed with exhaustion. But he was breathing. Iracema didn't think twice. She entered the warm flood water, feeling the mud sucking at her boots, and reached the boy with effort. He didn't react when she pulled him to herself. He was too light, skin and bones, as if he were already accustomed to days of hunger. She carried him inside, leaving a trail of water and mud across the rustic wooden floor. The boy's silence was more frightening than any crying. Inside the house, she placed him on her own bed, carefully removed his soaked clothes, covered him with the only clean sheets she still had. For hours she cleaned the wound on his forehead, with the little boiled water she kept in buckets. She spoke softly, in a mixture of Portuguese and words from the Guarani language she had learned in her 4 years living there, studying the medicinal plants of the region. "Everything will be all right, little one, you're safe now." He didn't wake up, but his small fingers, previously rigid with fear, finally relaxed. In the following 2 days, Iracema fed the boy with piranha and cassava broth, made with the little she kept in the pantry. The flood had completely isolated her house. The boat was trapped underneath the construction, and the communication radio remained silent, probably affected by the storm. She slept sitting in the rocking chair beside the bed, alternating between uneasy naps and moments of alertness. Her hands, small and marked by her work with plants, constantly checked the boy's temperature. When he muttered in his language during restless sleep, she only responded, "You're protected now. Nothing will hurt you here." On the 3rd day, the key change was subtle. The rain diminished to a constant drizzle, and the boy's eyes opened completely. Deep eyes, the color of jabuticaba fruit, that observed Iracema with a mixture of fear and curiosity. "What's your name?" she asked gently, offering water in an aluminum mug. He hesitated, looking at the water as if it might contain some hidden danger. "Raoni," he finally answered, with a hoarse voice. "Where do you come from, Raoni?" He pointed to the west, beyond the turbulent waters. Guadalajara 3 village. Iracema knew those people, one of the last indigenous communities of the Pantanal, known as the people of the waters. Skilled fishermen, expert canoeists. "The water took everyone," he continued, the first tears finally appearing. "My father tied me to the canoe, told me not to let go, but the canoe hit trees, broke, water too strong." Iracema felt a knot in her throat. This year's flood was the worst in decades. Many riverside communities had been devastated, and rescues, she knew, prioritized larger towns. The indigenous people, as always, were the last to receive help. How many days in the water? Raoni? 2, maybe 3. It was a miracle he was alive. A miracle, and the ancestral strength that ran in the veins of that small survivor. "I'll take care of you until we find your people," she promised, knowing it could be an impossible promise to keep. Night fell again over the Pantanal, but something had changed in the air. It wasn't just that the rain had diminished, it was a different silence, charged. Iratima was preparing more broth when she heard the sound, the rhythmic beating of paddles in the water. It wasn't the noise of rescue teams with their powerful motors. It was something more primitive, more determined. She approached the window cautiously, heart racing. The moon, which finally appeared between the scattered clouds, illuminated the scene that made her blood freeze. 5 canoes were advancing through the floodwater, surrounding her stilt house. In each vessel, men and women with dark skin, with body paintings that shone under the silver light. Guathi Threes. Raoni's tribe had found their way there, but there was no way to know if they came in peace or moved by ancestral distrust against white people. Raoni noticed her tension and got up from the bed with difficulty. When his eyes found the canoes through the window, a smile illuminated his face for the first time. "My people," he whispered. "They came." Irasima looked at the boy, then at the canoes that now touched the pillars of her house. Time was running out. She had less than a minute to decide: hide the boy and pretend she never found him, or face the judgment of a people who had every reason to distrust a white woman living alone in their territory. The rain began to fall hard again, as if nature itself wanted to mark the gravity of that moment. Irasima took a deep breath. This was no time for hesitation. With Raoni leaning on her arm, she opened the porch door that led to the external staircase of the stilt house. The rain had returned with intensity, transforming the world into liquid shadows. At the foot of the stairs, an elderly man was already waiting. His graying hair was tied in a single braid, decorated with macaw feathers. On his bare chest, geometric paintings told stories that Irasima couldn't read. What was most impressive were his eyes identical to Raoni's, but carrying the weight of many floods, many losses. "Shaman Kawam," Raoni murmured with evident respect in his voice. The old man raised his gaze to the boy, then to Irasima. There was no hostility there, only a silent assessment, as if he could see beyond skin and bones. "The plant woman saved me," Raoni continued in Portuguese, "so Irasima would understand. She took me from the water, healed my head." The shaman nodded slowly. When he finally spoke, his voice had the texture of ancient wood. "We found other survivors, few. We followed the call of the water spirits to here." He made a gesture to the others in the canoes, and a middle-aged woman quickly climbed the stairs. By her similar features and the way she embraced Raoni, she was clearly his mother. Silent tears ran down her face as she checked every inch of her son's body, as if she couldn't believe he was really there, intact. "Jandira lost her husband in the flood," Kawan explained. "She thought she had also lost her son." Irasima felt the weight of those words. How many others had been taken by the water? How many families separated forever? "Come in," she offered, opening the door wider. "The rain is getting worse." That's how her small stilt house, normally so quiet, filled with voices, smells, and colors. Not all the Guatna Threes came, only 7 of them, including Shaman Kawam and Jandira. The others remained in the canoes, vigilant. For hours, sitting in a circle on the floor of the living room, they shared stories of destruction. The village had been completely devastated by the sudden flood. 28 people had disappeared, including Raoni's father. The survivors were now seeking refuge in higher lands, where ancient archaeological sites, built by their ancestors precisely to escape the waters, offered some safety. "How long until you get there?" asked Irasima, serving the rest of the broth she had prepared. 3 days, replied Kawan, observing the sky through the window. "If the rain continues, maybe 4, and the new moon brings more water." Irasima knew this cycle well. The new moon, which would arrive in exactly 5 days, usually coincided with the maximum elevation of the waters in the Pantanal. If they didn't reach the elevated terrain by then, they could lose even more people. "I have a boat trapped under the house," she said suddenly, surprising herself with the offer. "With a motor, I can help transport the weakest." There was a heavy silence. The glances exchanged among the indigenous people spoke of decades of broken promises by light-skinned people. Cowan studied Irasima's face for a long moment. Why does a white woman live alone in the heart of the Pantanal? The tone was not accusatory, merely curious. Irasima felt the weight of the words. It was a question that many asked, but few had the courage to formulate directly. I came to study healing plants. I stayed because here I found peace. It wasn't the whole truth. There was more, much more, behind her self-exile. The fiancé who had abandoned her after the infertility diagnosis, the rejection from her conservative family in Corambo who wouldn't accept an incomplete woman, the depression that had almost consumed her. But that didn't matter now. What mattered only was that somehow fate had placed that boy in her path, and with him a purpose she had long lost. Jandira, who until then had remained silent, pressing her son against her chest, finally spoke. Her hands have the touch of the Jabiru. It was a reference to the sacred bird of the Pantanal, a symbol of protection and healing for the Guata Xanthres. Kor Pamsand agreed with a slight nod. The tension in the environment visibly decreased. We will rest here tonight, decided the shaman. Tomorrow, when the light returns, we will seek your boat, and you will come with us if that is your desire. It was more than an invitation. It was an unexpected alliance, sealed not with words or contracts, but with the fragile trust born of mutual need. In the early morning, while everyone slept scattered across the floor of her small house, Irasima remained awake, watching Raoni sleep peacefully beside his mother. She thought about the few belongings she had, about her notes on medicinal plants that were her only true treasure. She would take only the essentials. The rest would stay behind, like so many other things in her life. Through the window, she saw that the rain had finally stopped, giving way to a dense fog that covered the waters. But the river continued to rise, centimeter by centimeter. Time was running out. In the distance, a different noise caught her attention. It wasn't the sound of nature, nor of the indigenous canoes. It was the roar of powerful engines, cutting through the quietude of the Pantanal dawn. Her body tensed instantly. She knew that sound well. They were the boats of illegal loggers who took advantage of the floods to access protected areas, extract noble wood, and disappear before the inspection, always insufficient, could reach them. If they found the Guatathres, the confrontation would be inevitable. And in these confrontations, the indigenous people always lost. She woke Corfon with a light touch on the shoulder. The old man opened his eyes immediately, as if he had never really been asleep. "We need to leave now," she whispered. "The woodmen are coming." He nodded, without needing further explanations. In minutes, everyone was awake, gathering their few belongings in absolute silence. Raoni, still weak, was carried by one of the strongest men. Ko-an approached Irasima, while she stored her notebooks of annotations in a waterproof bag. "The spirits do not lie," he said enigmatically. "They said we would find a guardian in the waters. We thought they spoke of a place. It was a person." Irasima didn't know what to answer. She had never seen herself as a guardian of anything, much less as part of an indigenous prophecy. She had always been the exile, the inadequate one, the one who needed to flee to the middle of nowhere to find some purpose. And now, suddenly, she was necessary. That's when she realized it wasn't just her helping the Guatathres. It was them saving her from something much worse than the flood, the loneliness that was slowly consuming her. The engines were approaching. There was no more time. With quick and silent movements, the group descended to the canoes. 2 men dived under the stilt house, and with ropes and machetes, freed Irasima's boat from the moorings and branches that trapped it. It was a small vessel, but with a powerful motor, a gift from her father before their definitive rupture. In other circumstances, it would have been her pride. Now, it was the difference between life and death. Dawn found the group navigating through a labyrinth of submerged trees. Irasima guided her boat in front, with Raoni, Jandira, and Shaman Cowan. The 5 canoes followed right behind, cutting through the muddy waters with ancestral precision. They had managed to distance themselves from the loggers, but the danger was far from over. The sky, previously clear, was beginning to close again. Heavy clouds announced more rain, and the new moon, with its promise of even higher waters, was only 4 days away. The group's destination, the ancient indigenous mound known as Sacred Hill, was approximately 80 kilometers from there. Under normal conditions, it would be a 2-day journey. But with the flood, all the references were altered. Trees that served as natural markers were submerged, dry channels were now dangerous rapids, and the risk of disorientation grew with each kilometer. "We need to find high ground to rest," said Kawan, pointing to the sun that was already approaching its zenith. "The small ones and the elders cannot endure the heat in the water." Irasema nodded. They also needed to save fuel. Her boat consumed much more than the paddle-powered canoes, and there was no way to refuel in the middle of the flooded Pantanal. They continued for another hour until they spotted what appeared to be a small island, probably the top of a natural elevation now surrounded by the flood. As they approached, they saw that there were already occupants, a family of jaguars, mother and 2 cubs, also refugees from the waters. The felines observed the approach of the vessels with attentive eyes, but without hostility. The flood created strange truces between predators and prey. "Land is theirs," murmured Kalwan. "We'll look for another place." Raoni, who until then had been quiet, huddled against his mother's body, suddenly pointed to the west. "There, the hawk's nest." Everyone looked in the indicated direction. On the horizon, the unmistakable contour of a little hawk stood out, an artificial structure built by ancient Pantanal cowboys to observe cattle during floods. It was a wooden platform erected on pillars approximately 4 meters high, with a small shelter covered with straw. As they approached, they saw that the structure, although old, seemed resistant enough to support the group. Carefully, they helped the elders and children climb up the improvised ladder. The space was tight, but it offered protection from the scorching sun and the rain that would not be long in coming. While the others rested, Irasema and 2 Guataisu 3 fishermen took the opportunity to check the fishing traps they had set up during the journey. The flood brought fish in abundance, and in a short time they had collected enough to feed the entire group. Back at the lookout, Irasema observed how the indigenous people prepared the fish with skill, using only knives and the fire they managed to light with dry wood found on the platform. Kawan, noticing her interest, approached. "You know a lot about plants, but little about fish," he commented, with a slight smile on his wrinkled lips. "Knowledge is like water. It needs to flow, or it rots." That was the first time she saw him smile. Irasema accepted the roasted fish he offered, thanking him with a nod. "The loggers will continue searching," she said, keeping her voice low so as not to alarm the others. "They know there are centennial trees near the Sacred Hill." Kawan nodded gravely. "For 3 generations we have fought against those who cut the forest. Before there were few. Now there are many, with big machines and weapons." The shaman's outburst contained an ancestral pain that Irasema, even in her voluntary isolation, could understand. The Pantanal, one of Brazil's last natural frontiers, was being systematically destroyed by greed. Her small struggle to catalogue medicinal plants before they disappeared seemed insignificant compared to the daily battle of the Guatwa Threes for their very existence. The rain, as predicted, began to fall in the middle of the afternoon. It wasn't strong but constant, the type of precipitation that made the water level rise silently, without the alarm of storms. The group would remain there until dawn, when they would resume the journey. At night, while most slept, Raoni approached Irasema, who was keeping watch. The boy was visibly stronger. The wound on his forehead was beginning to heal, forming a thin line that would probably leave a permanent mark. "Can't sleep?" she asked, making space for him to sit beside her. He shook his head. "I dream of the water taking my father." There was an acceptance in his voice that was both impressive and devastating. Indigenous children learned early about the cycles of life and death, about losses and new beginnings. "Your father was a brave man," she said, repeating what she had heard Jandira tell. "You are too." Raoni was silent for a moment, watching the rain fall on the infinite waters. Grandpa Cowan says you have a strong spirit, like a tree that bends but doesn't break. Irasema smiled sadly. If only the boy knew how many times she had almost broken. Your grandfather is a wise man, but sometimes he sees what he wants to see. Raoni studied her with his ancient eyes. In such a young face, he never makes mistakes about people. He says you will help us protect the sacred hill from the bad men. Irasema felt a shiver that had nothing to do with the night breeze. It was as if, without realizing it, she had been dragged into a battle greater than her personal search for meaning, a battle for which she did not feel prepared. Dawn arrived with a truce in the rains and a disturbing discovery. One of the Guat Bathri, sentinels who had climbed to the highest point of the structure to observe the horizon, returned with worrying news. Columns of smoke were visible to the southwest, in the exact direction of the sacred hill. Fire on dry land, even with so much water nearby, can only be human work, concluded Khan, his face hardened by concern. The loggers have found our refuge. The sacred hill was not just an elevated place to escape the floods. It was an archaeological site, one of the few places where the history of the Guatathries was preserved in artifacts and cave paintings. It was also the last stronghold of centennial trees in the region, trees that the elders considered sacred, and that the loggers saw only as noble wood to be extracted. How long until we get there? Asked Irasema, already calculating the remaining fuel. With your boat, maybe by the end of the day, replied one of the fishermen. With the canoes, 2 days. The decision was made. Quickly. Irasema would go ahead with her boat, taking Cowan, 2 warriors, and Raoni, who refused to stay behind. Surprisingly, it was Jandira who insisted that her son go. He needs to see that not everything is lost, explained the mother, embracing her son one last time before departure. And I trust that you will protect him, she added, looking directly into Irasema's eyes. That vote of confidence, coming from a woman who had just found her son again after almost losing him forever, weighed more than any formal oath. With my life, promised Irasema, knowing it was not an empty guarantee. The waters were more agitated that day. Treacherous currents formed between the submerged trees, demanding all of Irasema's skill to navigate. Raoni, sitting beside her, served as a guide, pointing out safe channels that only eyes trained from childhood could identify. You're good at this, she praised, after the boy alerted her about a submerged trunk that would have damaged the propeller. My father was the best fisherman in the village, he replied with evident pride. He taught me to read the water from an early age. Around noon, the unmistakable sound of engines cut through the air. Cowan signaled for Irasema to turn off the motor. In absolute silence, they let the current carry the boat behind a set of partially submerged trees. Seconds later, 2 larger vessels passed less than 50 meters from them. They were logger boats, loaded with freshly cut logs. Armed men with shotguns guarded the cargo. They've already begun, murmured Cowan, his aged face further aged by pain. They're cutting the sacred trees. When the boats disappeared in the distance, Irasema restarted the motor. Time was now even more precious. It wasn't just about reaching the sacred hill before the new moon brought even higher waters. They needed to arrive before nothing remained to save. The sun was already leaning toward the west when they finally sighted the sacred hill. It was a natural elevation of approximately 30 meters above the normal water level, now transformed into an island in the middle of the flooded Pantanal. At its top, centennial trees formed a green crown that even from a distance revealed signs of devastation, newly opened clearings, scars in the millennial vegetation. Around the base of the hill, boats and cutting equipment could be seen. Irasema counted at least 5 large vessels and a dozen men. They have weapons, warned one of the Guatum 3 warriors, observing through an old pair of binoculars. And chainsaws. They're working fast. Corpun closed his eyes for a moment as if seeking wisdom somewhere beyond that desolate scenario. When he reopened them, his decision was made. We'll wait for darkness. The night is a friend to the Guatathries. The tactic was ancient and had worked for generations. Use darkness and knowledge of the territory to compensate for the disadvantage in weapons and numbers. But Irasema knew that this time it might not be enough. Modern loggers had powerful flashlights, generators, and worse, would not hesitate to use violence. While they waited a few kilometers away, hidden in a cove formed by submerged trees, she made a mental inventory of available resources. A boat with fuel for a few more hours, 2 old hunting shotguns that the Guatam 3s carried, machetes, and knowledge, both the traditional knowledge of the indigenous people and the scientific knowledge she had accumulated over years of study. That's when an idea began to form. Kormo, she called, the plants that grow on the sacred hill. Are any of them irritating to the skin or eyes? The elder looked at her with curiosity. Many. The strongest is what we call moon's tear. It burns like fire when it touches the eyes or throat. Irasema knew that plant. It was a species of pantanal nettle, rich in urticating compounds that, when pulverized, produced effects similar to tear gas. During her studies, she had documented cases of hunters who accidentally disturbed these plants and were temporarily incapacitated. Does it grow near the water? The shaman nodded, immediately understanding the plan that was beginning to form. At the edge of the hill, where the land meets the flood, there are many now. Night fell quickly, as always happens in the tropics. The moon, almost new, offered little illumination, exactly what they needed. With silent movements, guided by the Guatemala 3s who could see in the darkness like felines, they approached the base of the sacred hill. The loggers had set up an improvised camp on the least steep part of the elevation. Generators hummed, powering, powerful reflectors that illuminated the cutting areas. Even at night, the work continued. The devastation was even worse seen up close. Centennial trees lay cut down, their roots exposed like open wounds in the sacred earth. Some were more than 300 years old, silent witnesses to the history of the Guata 3s in that territory. Carson emitted a guttural sound of pain at seeing the destruction. "They're killing our grandfathers," he murmured, using the Guata 3 expression for ancient trees. Raoni, who had insisted on accompanying them despite protests, gripped Irasema's hand tightly. There was fear in his eyes, but also determination. While the 2 Guata 3 warriors circled through the water to locate the urticating plants, Irasema observed the camp, looking for vulnerabilities. That's when she noticed something that made her heart race. Gallons of fuel stacked dangerously close to one of the generators. If they could create enough confusion, it wouldn't be necessary to have a direct confrontation. An hour later, they were ready. They had collected a significant amount of the moon's tear, whose leaves were macerated and mixed with water in improvised containers. The 2 warriors positioned themselves at strategic points, armed with the old shotguns, not to injure, but to create a distraction at the right moment. Corwin, knower of ancient rituals, had prepared a mixture of herbs that, when burned, produced dense and aromatic smoke. To confuse the senses and drive away evil spirits, he explained, with a gleam in his eyes that mixed ancestral wisdom and tactical astuteness. Irasema looked at Raoni, who refused to stay in the boat. "You stay with me," she decided. "But do exactly as I say. No hesitation." The plan was simple but risky. Using the boat with the motor at minimum, they would approach from the back of the camp, while the warriors created a distraction with shots into the air and Korwan released. His ritual smoke, Irasema and Raoni would throw the containers with the urticating mixture near the generators and the loggers' rest area. If all went well, the confusion would allow them to damage the cutting equipment without direct confrontation. "We don't want to hurt anyone," emphasized Irasema. "We just want time until the environmental inspection arrives." It was a tenuous hope. Days before, using her still-functioning radio, she had managed to send an emergency message to the Ibama base in Corumba. There was no guarantee that anyone would come, especially with so many communities needing rescue during the flood, but it was the only official card they had to play. The execution began exactly at midnight. The shots sounded, echoing in the quiet, Pantanal night. Immediately the loggers went on alert, some running to check the source of the noise. Taking advantage of the confusion, Cowan lit his herb mixture at 3 different points around the camp. The smoke, dense and aromatic, began to spread, carried by the night breeze. "Now," whispered Irasima, guiding the boat silently. She and Rowney threw the first containers with the urticating mixture. The effect was immediate. Cries of pain and confusion filled the air as men tried to clean their eyes and skin of the caustic liquid. In the midst of the chaos, Irasima managed to get close enough to cut the fuel hoses of the generators and damage some chainsaws abandoned in the rush. That's when everything almost went wrong. One of the loggers, less affected than the others, spotted the boat. With a rifle in hand, he aimed directly at Irasima. The bang cut through the night, but it wasn't she who fell. It was Rowney. The boy had thrown himself in front of her at the last second, receiving the impact of the bullet in his shoulder. "No!" Irasema's cry tore through the silence of the night with a force she didn't know she possessed. It was a primitive sound, the roar of a mother protecting her cub, even if it wasn't her blood. In seconds, the Guatu 3 warriors boarded the logger, disarming him before he could shoot again. Irasema pulled Rowney into the boat, her heart beating erratically. The wound was bleeding a lot, but the projectile had passed through cleanly, without hitting major bones or arteries. Still, the boy needed urgent care. The mission was compromised. Korn arrived at the boat moments later, his face marked by concern. "We have to take him to the top of the hill. I have better herbs there." The chaos continued in the loggers' camp. Some were trying to contain a fire that had started when one of the generators exploded, an unplanned but welcome consequence of the operation. Others were still suffering from the effects of the moon's tear. Taking advantage of the confusion, the group managed to reach a small cove at the base of the sacred hill, far enough from the camp. From there they carried Rowney up the slope, to an area where stone ruins indicated the ancestral presence of the Guat Threes. The place radiated an energy difficult to describe, a feeling of suspended time, as if there the past and present coexisted in perfect balance. Corwin worked with precise movements, applying herb poultices to Rowney's wound. The boy, semi-conscious, murmured words in Guat Thu3 that Irasema didn't understand. "He is calling his father," translated Kuhuat with a grave voice. "He thinks he is departing to meet him." Irasema held Rowney's small, strong hand between hers. "Tell him it's not time yet, that he still has much to teach this white woman who barely knows how to read the waters." A slight smile appeared on the shaman's lips. "I already told him. And I also said that you promised to protect him. A Guatemala 3 never breaks a promise. A guardian, even less so." The night advanced as they watched over Rowney's restless sleep. In the distance, the lights of the loggers' camp had gone out. The silence was complete, except for the occasional call of a nocturnal bird. That's when the sound of engines cut through the quietude. Irasema and Cowan exchanged apprehensive looks. Could it be the loggers, reorganized for a counterattack? They cautiously approached the edge of the plateau to observe. What they saw made Irasema let out a sigh of relief. Boats with the Ibama emblem and the environmental police were approaching the sacred hill, emergency lights flashing in the darkness. Someone had heard her distress call. When dawn finally arrived, it brought with it a new reality. The loggers had been detained, their equipment seized. The operation, explained the environmental police commander, was part of a larger investigation into illegal extraction of wood on indigenous lands during floods, an environmental crime aggravated by the opportunistic exploitation of a natural disaster. Rowney's wound, now treated by a doctor from the rescue team, was healing well. The boy was conscious and surprisingly animated. "See? I protected you," he said to Irasema, with the pride of a small warrior. "Now we're even." She smiled, holding back tears. "Even? Not in 1,000 years. Little one." At the end of that day, the canoes with the rest of the Guatu 3 group finally arrived at the sacred hill. The reunion was marked by tears and smiles. Jandira, seeing her son wounded but alive, embraced Irasema strongly, without words. They weren't necessary. In the weeks that followed, as the waters slowly receded, something unexpected happened. the story of the solitary botanist who helped save an indigenous community, and an archaeological site from the hands of illegal loggers made regional headlines. Researchers from the Federal University of Mato Grosso do Sul appeared, interested in both the traditional knowledge of the Guata Threes and Iracema's studies on Pantanal medicinal plants. Suddenly, that forgotten corner of the Pantanal became the focus of a conservation project and valorization of indigenous knowledge. When the waters finally lowered enough for permanent decisions to be made, Kawand gathered the community and visitors at the top of the sacred hill. Under the watchful eye of all, he called Iracema and Raoni to the center of the circle. The flood takes away, but also brings, he said, his voice carrying the wisdom of many seasons. It took our homes, some of our sacred trees, and almost took this boy. But it brought this woman who learned to listen to the plants and now learns to listen to the river. With a solemn gesture, he placed around Iracema's neck a necklace made with seeds and a small piece of carved wood, a perfect replica of the Jabiru, the sacred bird of the Pantanal. From now on, you are Jabiru among the Guata Foravis. No longer, hey foreigner, no longer alone. Iracema accepted the gift with tears in her eyes. Her gaze met Raoni's, who was smiling openly, the scar on his shoulder now an emblem of courage that he displayed with childish pride. Beside him, Jandira observed the scene with a serene expression. The pain of losing her husband was still there, but now shared, diluted by the strength of the community that was rebuilding itself. Iracema's stilt house had been destroyed by the flood, but a new one was already being erected, larger, stronger at the edge of Guata III territory. It would be both a home and a study center where scientific knowledge and traditional wisdom could dialogue on an equal footing. And so, under the infinite sky of the Pantanal, a new story began to be written, no longer of isolation and losses, but of bridges between worlds that deep down were never really separated. Because in the waters that both take and bring, in the plants that both heal and protect, in the people who both suffer and are reborn, there exists a single truth. Everything is connected, in an invisible web that only truly open hearts can see. And it was this web that, in a decisive moment between life and absence, Iracema chose to preserve. Her choice that, like the Pantanal itself, would continue to renew itself with each season, each flood, each dawn. If this journey through the Pantanal touched your heart, don't keep that feeling just for yourself. Share your impressions in the comments. Subscribe to the channel for more narratives that celebrate Brazilian cultural richness, and leave your like as a sign of the waters that, just as in